When you really see what Philippians 4:13 says, I think you'll be very surprised. If you're wanting to learn how to read and study the Bible, you've come to the right place. This is another Bible study walkthrough. We have a completely free 40-day Bible study program linked in the description below. Go check that out. We're in Philippians 4:13, right? A very popular Bible verse a lot of people know about. I'm going to read it, and what we're going to do along the way is we're going to take note of any helpful tips, techniques, or ways to approach the Bible, and hopefully you'll have new skills by the end of this, or at least have your current skills developed a little more and sharpened. So first things first, when you read the Bible, know who's talking and know who's being spoken to, or who's receiving the message, right? So Paul is speaking to the church in Philippi, a bunch of believers, a Christian community, and he says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Now, he does say all things generally. I want to make that very clear. But sometimes when you read the Bible, this is my first official tip. Sometimes there's something called hyperbolic language. Another way of explaining what that is just exaggerated language. And we use this in our English language all the time. We make statements that we don't take literally, but are just dramatic for shock effect, right? They're exaggerated. So does Paul literally mean all things here? I'm not saying this is hyperbolic, but what I am saying is sometimes in Scripture, there are hyperbolic statements that the surrounding context will help us make sense of. So if you're wondering, is this hyperbolic? Let's read and let's figure out what Paul says before this, right? So tip number 2, or technically 3 if you count the whole audience and author thing, read a verse in context. Know what comes before it. Know what it means, know the point of that, know what comes after it, and know how they all connect. In other words, know how verse 13 connects to the verses that come before it. Know how verse 13 connects to what comes after it, and you'll have a clearer picture of what it means. So Paul here in verse 10, he says, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you revived your concern for me. So Paul's talking about an experience that he's had with those in Philippi, and I'm just giving you some background context so that we can make sense of verse 13, right? He says, you were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. So I feel like I'm reading someone's mail right now. I feel like this is illegal. This doesn't seem like it's intended for me. I feel kind of left out, right? I don't know what he means that the church revived their concern for him. I don't know what it means that at one time they had no opportunity, but apparently now they had the opportunity, right? So when you approach a biblical text, one of the greatest tips I can give you is to ask questions. Don't assume to know things. Don't define things out of assumptions and go, well, I think he means. What we should do is ask questions, and hopefully as we read a little further, those questions will be answered. So for instance, I go, when did this happen? When did they revive their concern for Paul? What does that even mean, right? So because I've asked these questions, I'm going to be looking for the answers to these questions as I continue reading. That's what a good Bible student does, is you ask questions, and in faith, you anticipate that God will answer somehow. And if it's not immediately answered as you read the rest of the chapter, read the rest of the book, read what comes before it, and you'll likely have an answer. Okay, so whatever this is, Paul rejoiced in the Lord greatly. This word greatly is a qualifying word, meaning how much did Paul rejoice greatly? It's just something worth noting because that's not a word that's used a lot. Okay, it's actually a pretty unique word. It notes an extreme amount of joy, but it's about what? This word that lets us know what he's rejoicing about, that now at length you've revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. So when I say ask questions, and then hopefully as you read and continue going a little further, the answers will come. I mean this. What does it mean that they revived their concern for Paul? Well, he kind of explains it in the rest of the verse. You were concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. So that brings clarity to what it means that their concern was revived, meaning they had concern for Paul, but they had no real opportunity to effectively show or demonstrate that concern in a real way, right? So this is what I do when I read the Bible. I ask questions, and hopefully the surrounding context will bring clarity. Verse 11, not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have learned, the word for here, it's just something that I'm always highlighting, man. If you've been through Bible walkthroughs with me, you know that's my guy right there. The word for, that's my guy. Because it acts as a sort of because quite often. Meaning, it goes like this. I'm not speaking of being in need, because I've learned in whatever situation I'm in to be content. So you might ask the question, wow, why is Paul not speaking of being in need? Well, because he's learned in whatever situation he's in to be content, right? This word content is something that I just want to pay attention to, right? Because it's something that Paul has learned to be, right? So some questions I have about that is, what does content mean? What's the Greek word that's used here? What's the definition of that? How is it used in other contexts, right? When did Paul learn to be content? These are questions I ask, and hopefully as I read, God will clarify and answer these questions. But if you don't know how to ask the right questions, you can't really arrive at the right answers, at least not as easily. So Paul's talking about not being in need because he's learned in whatever situation to be content. He'll go on to explain this. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In other words, he's expanding on what it means to be content in any situation. He's going to be more specific in verse 12. Well, when I'm brought low. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my blue highlighter to note in what situations Paul has learned to be content. Well, whatever situation, when he's brought low, when he's abounding, in every circumstance, right? And as we read on, what you're going to see is a list developing. It's very important to notice any kind of lists that take place. What Paul's going to do in verse 12, and I know this because I've read it enough, as my kids scream in the background, is I know that this is a list because I've read it, and note whatever situations he's listing. Being brought low, abounding, any and every circumstance. He's going to say, I've learned the secret of facing plenty, and we'll get there. But here's what I want you to notice. I'm going to highlight in yellow this word that I notice is repeating. And when you read the Bible, pay very close attention to any words that repeat. Besides the typical and, the, but, like words like learned, I don't see any immediately here. But this is important, right? This tells me that Paul is emphasizing something that has to do with learning something. The fact that this is learned brings clarity to what's going on here because it's a repeating word. Even though it's just used twice, it's in like 2 verses. He's learned to be content. Then he'll go on, okay? I have learned what? The secret of facing plenty and hunger. So the first time he talks about learning something, it had to do with learning what? Contentment. But here, he says, I have learned the secret of facing. So I'm going to grab my blue highlighter. And just as I was highlighting the kind of situations Paul has learned to be content in, I'm going to continue doing that. In what situations has Paul learned to be content in? Well, facing plenty, right? Facing hunger, facing abundance, facing need, right? So what I notice is that the word need is used again, just like it was in verse 11, when he says, hey, I'm not speaking of being in need. In verse 12, he says, I've learned how to face need, right? So I just want to take note of that because both times the word need is mentioned, there are 2 different things being emphasized about the concept of need. The first is that Paul is not in need. The second time the word need is seen in this passage, it refers to Paul actually has learned how to face it, or the secret of facing that, right? So since I saw the word, verse 11, the word learned, he learned contentment, I might ask myself, is this just another way of saying how to be content? It's just something I'm thinking about, because the last time I saw the word learned, it had to do with learning in any situation to be content. So is Paul starting a new idea, or is he continuing to expand on that idea of learning how to be content? Because he's learned the secret of facing these things, right? And something I might ask is, as I ask this question, is this contentment? Is the secret contentment? Hey, does contentment relate to plenty, need, abundance, hunger? And if so, how? What's the connection? Or when Paul says, I learned contentment in any situation, does that idea relate to facing plenty, facing hunger, facing abundance, facing need, right? There's a secret that he's learned to face these things, right? Now we get to verse 13, and he says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. What I want to take note of is this. When you read the Bible, this is what you do. You go, you know what, Paul? You didn't really mention the secret. What's the secret? You kind of left us hanging. That's what I want to notice as a biblical student, as someone who's trying to learn the Word of God and live it out. I go, Paul, you didn't tell us the secret. You just said you've learned the secret of facing it. What is it? Well, sometimes the authors will put a pause on an idea and then expand on that, or actually explain that and come back to it in future verses. So he says, I can do what? Where's my blue highlighter? All things. How does Paul face plenty, hunger, abundance, need? How does Paul be content in any situation? There's a secret. He does all things. Need, abundance, hunger, plenty. And I highlighted those in blue because that's a continuation of the list of the kind of situations Paul has learned to face. Paul has learned to be content in. And he kind of sums it all up again by saying, just so you know, all things, every situation, I can do all that through him who strengthens me. Who's the him? And why does Paul need strength? These are just questions I initially have. Why does Paul need strength? It seems like he needs strength to face these situations in life. But that strength comes through the him. Now, verse 14, he'll go on, yet it was kind of you to share my trouble. Almost like, despite all that, it is still kind that you shared in my trouble. So I'm going to highlight this in blue because I think the trouble here is actually a good summary word of everything he's said he's learned to face. God strengthens Paul to do all things, and the specific things he has in mind are plenty, need, abundance, hunger, right? Abounding, being brought low, as we saw in verse 12. So when I study the Bible, I want to go back, I want to backtrack a little bit, and if I have to, I'll read verse 11 and 12 again and see if I see any similar words, any synonymous words or ideas that relate to hunger, abundance, plenty, need, right? Because I just want to pay attention to that. Because this word trouble seems to be a good way to summarize the specific things that Paul is strengthened to face well. The secret is he does all things through God, who provides him the strength. Now, for the 21st century Christian who takes this and goes, I can apply this to doing anything I put my mind to, think about the things Paul is referring to God strengthening him to face. What things? You might go, well, anything. Well, now I've made this a generalized promise that applies to any circumstance. And I go, I can decide to do anything. I can choose to jump off a roof and God will strengthen me to face that and do that well. That would be an out of context application. Because even though it says all things, the things he's referring to specifically have a kind of category. They're a kind of trouble. Not just trouble, he also talks about abundance for sure, right? But the all things that God strengthens Paul to do, meaning Paul needs strength to face them, refers to he mainly has in mind the trouble he's going to go through in life, right? So if you're going to claim this verse, what you're saying is, I can face the difficulty God brings me through, and even the abundance God brings me through, and the plenty, by having the strength he provides. That's how I face that. That's how I'm content. That's how I deal with every situation. I'm content because through him I'm strengthened, and he's enough for me. So the kind of things specifically Paul has in mind are those situations that God leads him into. So you might say it like this: I can do all the things God has for me to do, God intends to lead me into, through him who strengthens me. This is not just anything I put my mind to and decide, you know what, I want to do that, and I'm going to stamp God's approval on that. No, these are the things God has for you to go through and face. It's not all bad. Sometimes it's abundance and plenty, but you still need the strength to face that well. Mainly, though, Paul's referring to the trouble he's faced. All right? So hopefully along the way, you've taken a few tips. You've maybe recognized a few certain techniques and ways to approach the Bible you didn't know about before. I pray this was a blessing to you. We have a bunch more Bible study walkthroughs you can check out to really begin sharpening your skills and know how to study and read the Bible better. We also have a completely free 40-day Bible study program, a 27-day program, an 11-day program, all online, completely free. It's self-paced. You'll go deep into learning how to read and study the Bible. Those are all linked in the description below, as well as on our website at abovereproachministry.com. Go check that out, and thanks for watching today's Bible study walkthrough. Bye.